All right, welcome on. We're going to do a little podcast here on the draft. We'll do the first half or so here on YouTube and on the public pod, and then do part 2 on Dunc'd On Prime. So let me send out a little tweet noting that we are live, and then we can get started. All right, the Deni Avdija trade, Danny. Yes.
Let's see. Seeing how few picks got traded for established players.
Bam Adebayo extension. Yeah, we have to hold still because Dan's going to take a thumbnail of us here. So, all right, let's get rolling and do a podcast starting right now. The 2024 NBA draft is in the books, Danny, and we had a few big surprises. Nothing crazy in terms of trade activity. I think there probably was a thought that there would be more. I think we felt the same way actually last year, just with so many teams having picks, trying to get veteran players to get better. I also think, though, in the end, these teams are like, maybe if we get a guy who can contribute, who's making $2 million a year, given our tax situation, that might actually be a good thing. So I think we'll just go through in order, and when a trade impacted a pick, we can discuss it. And there are a couple, of course, extension that were agreed to, or I guess new contracts in most of these cases. So let's get rolling here. Number 1 overall, Hawks have not made a trade yet. Woj reported that Reed Sheppard was actually the other guy they were interested in, rather than Alex Sarr, who apparently they never got in for a workout. Ends up being Risacher, however.
Risacher not in tier 1 for either one of us, though he was close to that, I believe, for each of us. And I'm intrigued by Risacher's fit with Jalen Johnson, somebody who we're not really hearing in trade rumors, because the idea that Johnson could take on some tough defensive assignments. And, ideally he's going to be a good shooter, that whatever form the Hawks take after this point, he can be a fit. So it's unusual, to have your forwards set up non-star, probably in all likelihood. But I think that Risacher, even if I wasn't the highest on him, this isn't like an abysmal pick.
No, like I said in the scouting report, I fully anticipate that he will be a guy who gets a second contract, and that will be whatever the inflation adjusted $25 million a year or so is. I do see him as a guy who maybe all-star potentially if you squint hard. And Gavoni and I had an interesting talk about him. I didn't debate him as much as I did on some of the other guys, or he debated me at times too on that. It was a great show. If you're a Dunc'd On Prime subscriber, I think you'd be very interested to listen to it, in particular given where some of the guys that we were discussing ended up going. But I would say that Risacher, if he works out, it's because his shot just becomes really, really good. I do think there's a little bit more playmaking and on-ball stuff to unlock than what he showed. We only averaged like 1 assist a game in France. Now, John, he was very big on his defense, and he said, well, hey, when they needed a stop in Europe, they put this guy on, Mike James or whoever the guy might be. And my thought on that was like, okay, and he's like, there's no Mike James in college basketball. Okay, yeah, that's probably true, but there's a lot better guys than Mike James in the NBA. And I don't think that Risacher has the elite tools or lateral movement, length, to really make guys uncomfortable. Like, could he guard a guy like that in a pinch and not get completely embarrassed? Yeah, maybe he could. But he's not really a number 1 defender on the perimeter. And then it can make things a little more difficult for your team building if your 3-man is not capable of being that sort of a defender. But John was higher on him. My thought was kind of like, well, yeah, they put him on him, and like it's good. Like for an 18-year-old, I'm sure he was good in the French league, but because there are just so few what we would consider NBA athleticism wings, like yeah, of course he was the best option to guard Mike James on his team. Um, and he said they had a really good defense. So Jonathan's watched more of him than me. If he is correct, then I think this does end up as a pick that is totally justified of going at number one. And I don't dislike Risacher. I think there are just other guys in this draft that I like better. And, taking him at 4 or 5, I think would be totally normal in a normal draft.
Sure. And I mean, I brought up when we talked about it, even though I don't like Risacher as much as Brandon Miller, the idea that those two guys aren't like miles and miles apart. And that's one of the things you talked about this with Gavoni in your thing, is that like, this is a weak draft, but it's not like it's horrendous top to bottom. And I mean, I watched 25 guys. We'll talk about a fair amount of them over the course of this. So I think Risacher is going to be an NBA player. And also I'm interested in what this does for DeAndre Hunter. Like, I mean, I don't think Hunter has done so well that you have to like seriously consider him in how you're managing the rest of the team, but he does have 3 more years at about 23 million a year. And so where he fits in on this iteration of the Hawks is something to keep an eye on. But I think he's probably just going to stick around because you can have more forwards and everything else.
Well, and they need more forwards. We talked about that, and when they kind of took their swoon and that play and lost to the Bulls last year, like it was obvious that they just like didn't have anywhere near enough players, even with Hunter and even with Jalen Johnson. Like they had no backup forwards to speak of. Sadiq Bey was out, and they were relying on like a Wes Matthews. So even if they don't make any moves, like Risacher hopefully can at least come in and give him some decent minutes off the bench in this first year. And this also, had they gone Sheppard, which I probably would have done. I just think Sheppard is better, and I would have just figured it out. I think like they're not such a good team that you just got to go best player available. Now Sheppard might not have been too interested in that, given that there are 2 really high profile guards ahead of him. But maybe they would have felt like, oh, that really reduces our leverage to say we're going to keep one of these guys. I mean, they could have just made Reed Sheppard the 3rd guard in the first year as well. So, but it does seem like now it's, in terms of fit, it makes more sense for them to hold on to both of those guys if they're not loving what the offers were. And we'll get to that, the lack of trades as time goes on here. But I thought it certainly was possible that DeJounte or Trey could get moved tonight, and we did not see that happen.
We did not. And instead, something that did seem likely ended up happening, which is that Alex Sarr never worked out for the Hawks. The Hawks did not take him, and so he fell to the Washington Wizards. And I had Sarr number 1, you had him number 2, I believe, as things kind of squared up. And hopefully in time, not immediately, he can provide the defensive foundation for successful Wizards teams down the road. And ideally he can combine that with some floor spacing, a little bit of versatility offensively and defensively could be good for the Wizards, who are very unsure. Like the roster is in flux. Let's put it that way. And so,
yeah.
And so that way, if you end up with more of a group that makes sense to switch, by all means. If you end up needing to play more of a drop, you can do that with Sarr. And so I think that I liked Sarr. I liked it best of this no matter what, but not no matter what, because I mean, there's teams that would have been better off with Reed Sheppard. But I think that I'm happy that this kind of ended up happening for him. And like for Sarr, the other benefit, like we talked about why he might not want to work out for the Hawks previously, but going to, even if it's a significantly weaker roster right now, but kind of an organization that knows where it is and that he can take them at pace. I think that's a good thing for Sarr, and he's played in a lot of different situations over his long professional life relative to his overall age, because he started with Real Madrid back when he was like 16.
And there's an indication that Sarr wanted to be in Washington. That's part of why he didn't work out for Atlanta. And the reason for that, apparently, according to reports, was that he just wanted to be in a team where he would just have a lot of runway to explore some of his offensive ability, which I think it makes perfect sense for him. I think his agents actually did a good job of getting him onto this kind of tabula rasa Washington team. And we'll talk about the trade with Portland momentarily. And also I think the Wizards hilariously are probably a better organization right now than the Hawks. And Brian Keefe is a well-known developmental coach because he goes to Atlanta. He's probably okay. Yeah, he's going to play pick and roll with Trae Young all the time or DeJounte Murray, and they still got Brogdon. There's this pressure to win, right? Because they are, as Lee says, so right now are out there 25 through 27 picks, and that might lead to him, becoming a more useful player for the Hawks. But it might not. It may tend to foreclose some of the higher end outcomes, at least the way most guys see it. Is like, oh, if I didn't develop, it's because I wasn't given a chance. Like, I feel like if you can do something in the NBA, generally, like, teams are so desperate for
They'll
guys
find
who
a
can
way.
do something that, like, you'll figure it out, right? Like this idea that, like, oh, I just, if only James Wiseman had gone to a team where he could have, like, spread his wings, he would have become a superstar. Like, no, I completely disagree with that. I think that can maybe be true a little bit on the margins, but I think in terms of the other thing that was pointed out too is, like, the Hawks have a bunch of commitments to guys already. They're trying to win. Their salaries are impacted. They seemingly always are. They got to pay Jalen Johnson too in the front court. Whereas, again, tabula rasa for Washington, Sarr, if he works out, no problems giving him the max extension. He's now the face of their rebuild in a way that he probably isn't with the Hawks, who aren't necessarily rebuilding. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And this is, I had Sheppard and I had Sarr in my top tier. I understand them taking Sarr here as well. One thing I do like about Sarr is he can fit with whoever the next guy is, right, in this
Yeah.
rebuild. Whereas Sheppard, it's like, all right, well, we can't draft another small guard now because we have him. Sarr even maybe could play some four, and generally, and I mean, as you look ahead to 2025, this is the case. There's really, as far as I know, at least at this point, only one center that would be considered even at the top, and I don't know if he's going to get there. So that's Malawak, who's going to Duke. I was impressed by, though he had a bad hoop summit. So, if you're trying to get a Cooper Flag or an Ace Bailey or Dylan Harper or something like that, it's easier to fit. But I mean, I think Sheppard can play on or off the ball, as we'll get to. But let's talk about this crazy trade now that definitely didn't see coming, except that we knew that the Portland Trailblazers would be shedding money in some form or fashion.
Yeah, I mean, it ends up kind of accomplishing a couple of different goals for the teams involved, and it's a fascinating deal. So, Deni Avdija goes from the Washington Wizards to the Portland Trailblazers in exchange for Malcolm Brogdon, the 14th overall pick in this draft, and we'll get to who they took with that a little bit later. And then, do you want to talk about the other stuff? It's a little bit weird.
No, go ahead.
I'm trying to pull if I could get the exact terminology on it. It's the second most favorable of the picks that the Trailblazers have in the 2029 first round, and then 2 second round picks.
Yeah, so this is pretty interesting value here. And the Wiz take on more salary, which really little opportunity cost for them to do that. They're still basically right at the cap, even now. We'll get to the Blazers side of this in a second. So let's just look at it from the Wizards standpoint.
Oh, briefly to note, the picks that Portland has in 2029: unprotected Boston, unprotected Milwaukee, and their own.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So, and unprotected Milwaukee is a pretty interesting one. Like, you would imagine that's probably like you're getting 2 bad lottery picks for Avdija. I mean, that's not too bad. And you're also, as Washington, kind of pushing some obligations further down the road. Or I guess if you're, just pushing everything further down the road. And maybe your feeling was that Avdija was a little bit of a paper tiger with what he showed on this team, that maybe he was kind of in the way of Koulibaly, or, we'll see what happens now with Kuzma as well. But this is just a bet that Avdija is not that good. Portland's making the bet that he is. I think Portland has a decent chance of him improving his trade value there, especially as his contract declines and fits into that mid-level trade exception. But I think for Washington, you're just like, you know what? Deni Avdija isn't going to make or break us. We really like someone at 14. They ended up getting Bub Carrington there. We'll talk about in a second. I know you were very high on him. So, and I think I don't know if they would have traded Carrington straight up for Avdija. This deal was done before they knew exactly who would be there at 14. And then they have another pick that has, at least some decent upside in 2029. And so I think like Avdija, if this was the best deal for Avdija, I understand trading him now. I don't think this is like were they going to get a better return than this from like a good team? Hard to imagine that they would, right? Like those teams don't have draft picks that have a pretty decent chance of being in the lottery in 2029, plus this lotto pick this year. And it seems like they were more interested in this draft than some others were, particularly because as you're rebuilding and you want to be bad for next year, like having rookies out there is a pretty good way to do that.
Well, and kind of beyond that, the Wizards are desperately looking to kind of build up their young talent. I mean, they have, if you consider Poole and Kuzma kind of in a separate category, then Koulibaly, then of course Alex Sarr, but then like Kispert, we'll see where he is. Johnny Davis.
Talk was that he was in trade talks potentially.
Like Johnny Davis, Patrick Baldwin Jr., those guys might both get option years decline. Vukcevic, we'll see where he fits in. And like Omarui, I'm interested in, but like I don't think of him as like a foundational young piece there. So
yeah, well, he was 27, so that's probably
there's also that.
accurate.
And so from Washington's perspective, it's like, yeah, getting a few more bites at that apple. And Avdija, I brought this up ad nauseum with him, is that he is simultaneously a good player, but probably not in the right stage to be a part of the next great Wizards team, just because it's going to take them a longer time in this. And while his contract is team friendly and will be, with it being descending for long enough, you run into the extension issues because his contract is so cheap that it might be hard to extend. And B, it's like, I think of Avdija as like a good forward, not a great forward, and forwards are scarce, but the idea that he's going to become like a top 10 player at his position, like that's probably pretty lofty based on what he has shown. So I think his value could hold firm, and it maybe could increase a little bit, but I don't think it was going to be like, oh, all of a sudden you're getting 5 firsts for him like Mikal Bridges.
No, one wouldn't think so. Although there might be a decent chance that both of the picks that they got are higher than any of the picks that the Knicks gave up for Bridges in the end. Let's talk about Carrington now at 14. We could finish up on the Wiz and then move to the Portland aspect of this.
Absolutely. So Carrington, and I ended up putting him 5th on my board in the same tier with Zaccharie Risacher. And that isn't because I think Bub Carrington is an unbelievable talent. I mean, that's generally what we've talked about with this class. But he, to me, has the clearest line to being a point guard who is functional on both ends of the floor outside of Reed Sheppard. And good positional size, about 6'4", and his jump shot, like his 2-point jump shot, was fabulous. His 3-pointer was a little bit shaky, but I didn't see anything wrong with it overall. And Carrington, he pretty good passing vision. He was like making cross-court passes, which was pretty exciting. There weren't a lot of those guys in this class. And so with Carrington, you get a player who can fit into your backcourt now. And yeah, my hope is that he'll be a starter, but they took him at 14. And so that means if you don't feel as wedded to it. So if the best player available for you in the 2025 draft is a point guard, okay, so be it. And he has enough positional size. Maybe he can even defend some twos. So I really like Carrington. I think that he will be successful. And to get him at 14, I mean, that's fabulous.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. Like if this guy, like he has this high release, long wingspan, can play pick and roll, like you do really have to account for him in the mid-range. And I do think the 3 will come around eventually. And I don't think he's going to be like horrible on defense. Like he's still kind of more of a 1-2 defender, pretty thin, but we've seen guys with that body type get a little bit more athletic. I think his finishing will get better because I think he can get pretty decent extension, but he's not explosive. He's not blowing by guys necessarily. I mean, I think in style, like he just has kind of like a cool style to him. as well, and he also kind of has this like infectious enjoyment of playing. Jamal Crawford might be a little bit of a comp for him. Carrington's like a better rebounder, tougher, better defensively. Crawford had maybe a little bit more bounce and separation, but kind of that same sort of kind of game where he's like a scorer. But I think he'll have the ability to have a more complete game than Crawford. But hey, I mean, honestly, like if he has Jamal Crawford's career, that would be pretty fantastic. So, yeah, I think certainly like he has a standout skill that you have to account for, and I'm not as high on him as you, but I also wasn't really particularly high on anyone outside of like the top maybe 4 or 5 on my board anyway.
Right, and I think that's a part
Yeah.
of the story here. Like, I mean, well, I'll talk because I did 25 guys for this class of like that the margins between, even though I have a lot of different tiers, between the 6th guy on my board and the 20th guy on my board isn't that huge in this class, but there are just delineations and distinctions that are worth getting into. I think
and then you get down to Dalton Connect after that.
Yeah, Dalton Connect 24th on my board. But I think we could transition to the Portland Trailblazers. And so I talked about how
we got to talk about their last pick too.
Oh, sure. You want to
they traded from 26 up to 24, basically at the price of number 51. Good piece of work there by the Knicks, kind of aided by Woj, who was very public about like, oh, they're actually like having trade talks. Although that ended up being the case with their 26 pick, which they moved as well. But to move up from 26 to 24 for the Wizards, and give up the 51st pick, that was a good piece of business for the Knicks, because basically like they weren't going to draft any guys different. Like unless the Wizards were so scared that the Knicks were going to draft their guy at 24, you don't move down a spot to and not get the guy that you want, right? So clearly the Knicks like convinced them, that the Wizards, that someone was going to jump up ahead of them and get the guy they wanted, which was Keyshawn George.
It's interesting you brought up that up. I think it's a good piece of business for the Wizards because all they gave up is 51. Like, I mean, 51, generally speaking, the two pathways for that is you're getting a guy in a two-way, or you're getting a player like we saw with Trayce Jackson-Davis, where you're trying to use that roster spot, save a little bit of money. Those picks are generally going to flow to second apron teams, is the way that's going to go. The 50s, that's going to be, I think that's going to be part of the story for tomorrow. And the Wizards aren't a second apron team. And generally you're not getting a ton in those circumstances. Maybe you're getting another future second. And so if you think that Keyshawn George is your guy, he wouldn't have been like, he wasn't the top guy that I had left, but George.
Yeah. I mean, it was a fine move for the Wizards, but it's also a good piece of business for the Knicks to get the exact same guys you're going to get and get something that they probably manufactured out of thin air, basically.
Yeah, they probably got an extra second round pick, and they gave up a lot of picks yesterday. So getting some back can be useful. And for George, he's Swiss born, interesting. So like when I started watching film on him, I'm like, oh, this guy, like he's pretty bad on ball for a guard. He's a limited athlete. And then when I looked at the measurements, I'm like, oh, well, the thing there is that he's forward sized. And so I think that George is going to evolve into, and he had some growth spurts in like the equivalent of high school of the, like, I think he's going to grow into maybe more of like a less athletic Cam Johnson, that kind of situation, maybe where I'm not saying he's the level of shooter that Johnson was. He's also a lot younger, thankfully, than Johnson was when he came into the league. And so if you think that a forward sized guy, there were some positives in the defensive film, even though I think he's a very limited athlete, can do a little bit with the ball in his hands. And so as the Wizards are figuring all of this out, having somebody who can space the floor, who has a little bit of diversity in their skill set, sure, why not?
Yeah, didn't really have much of an opinion on him. Like, it's basically going to come down to whether he can make shots, it seems like, and be passable on defense. But they don't exactly have like a ton of like great shooters in the pipeline there either. So I would understand them targeting him. Let's turn to the Portland side of this now. And they moved Brogdon, who does have some value, probably not first round value. Certainly wasn't going to have first round value in a deal that also saved the Blazers money, which was a big deal for them. Now, to me, the Blazers are in not maybe quite as early in the rebuild as the Wizards are, but pretty darn close. So the first thing you think of is like, well, if Avdija didn't make sense for the Wizards and they were willing to move him, like, why does he make sense for the Blazers? And I do have a little bit of trouble answering that question. And I guess what I come back to is number one, the savings. Number two, I think that Avdija is in a decent position to maintain or even improve his trade value as time goes on, as his salary declines and the cap goes up and more teams get into second apron hell and are just desperate to trade for a guy. Maybe you could get an unprotected pick later for him from a team that could end up collapsing. And also, I think he gives you a little bit more cover now. I don't know whether it's with ownership. Like, there has been talk like they're trying to get better. They're trying to be this year's Houston. I mean, he does make them better. Like, they had one forward on the team who was playing at really an NBA level last season. So you put him at the 3, Grant at the 4. Now you've got Clingan and Ayton at the 5. And, you still got the 3 guards even after you move Brogdon. So it's like closer to being like an actual NBA rotation. And so I don't know that this is like the greatest thing in the world for like their ultimate destiny, but this is a way to show, all right, we've made a little bit of progress this year. Also, it can be cover if you just decide to move Jeremy Grant either now or at the trade deadline, that you still have at least like one NBA level of forward that you can trot out there and a guy who can take some steps forward and just kind of be an organizational win. But ultimately what it comes down to is just like, how good is this guy? I mean, this is a challenge trade. There are all these things that are ancillary and fit into like the narrative of the organization, all that shit. I don't really care about that. I care about whether they won the trade. And I think Avdija has enough talent that maybe he will. And the Blazers, maybe they see themselves as being a little bit closer. Maybe they saw themselves just like, how bad we were last year was just a fucking embarrassment, and we need a better development situation where we can actually not just be getting completely killed every night. And Avdija can help us with that, and also he can get better as well and give us some passing and toughness and defense. So I don't necessarily know who I think won this trade at this point. It makes a little more sense for the Wizards, but it easily could end up being the Blazers depending on how Avdija develops.
Yeah, it could be, but I don't think trades have to necessarily have a winner and loser. I see the logic more clearly for the Wizards, but Avdija could play and he could fit in. And the other possibility for Portland, which I think bears some emphasis, is that they could simultaneously be better than they were, but still be bad enough to get a pretty damn good pick in the 2025 draft. Like maybe they push for the first 30 games, 40 games, and then they move Jeremy Grant at the deadline if something better hasn't come along, and then or Simons or anything like that. And then the other thing, and this is a really fascinating parallel with a trade the Blazers made a couple of years ago, is that cleaning up their debt obligation, basically getting under the tax in this move, gives them more latitude in negotiations for other trades. Now, they don't have to save money in a Jeremy Grant deal. They can't take a ton on.
Well, and as we talked about, they probably just couldn't, right? We talked about
Sure.
that yesterday, that whoever was trading for him probably wouldn't want to be hard capped by potentially taking back more than they were sending out.
For sure. And so with Grant, with Simon, some of these guys that they could still move, they're not foreclosed, even if it's a little bit harder now that these picks are off the table. But they can make those moves with a little bit more freedom. And so the parallel there was they made the Norm Powell trade before the CJ McCollum trade. And so that,
right.
They basically, then they didn't have to shed money in that deal, and it gave them some more latitude. And the CJ McCollum trade, I think, worked out pretty well for the Blazers. And so I think it's good work by Cronin in that respect. And with Avdija, he's going to be able to fit into the mid-level trade exception in a couple of years. That is probably going to be a new trendy way for some trades to happen, just because it's a way that some of these mechanics get ignored, some of the new restrictions, so you can make some of this stuff work. And he's a good player. And so whether it's Avdija plus Grant or it's Avdija and somebody else at the 4 because Jeremy Grant got traded, like, he can be a part of your rotation while also simultaneously not being so great that if you need to get worse, that you have to do that, because we already saw that with Deni Avdija this past season.
Yeah, and it's not like they had to get rid of Brogdon. We talked about this yesterday, that okay, he's an expiring contract. If your best offer for him was 2 seconds, like, might as well just hold on to him. But he also opens up that 3-guard rotation now for Simons, Sharp, and Henderson. And now you don't have to like move Sharp to the 3 anymore either, which I was just not really fit for, and you can just split up the guard minutes, hopefully, among those three guys. And then going back to Washington, Brogdon fits in here, as a guy, maybe I'm sure he's going to be available from the moment he hits Reagan Airport, but if they do hold on to him, that could maybe mean that they don't re-sign Tyus Jones. I probably would just bring Tyus Jones back just to like have him, but maybe they're just like, well, we don't want Bub Carrington to not play at all, and Bub Carrington could also probably be a pretty good tank commander for us this year as well. So I think they'll try to move Brogdon, and they'll probably try to do it to take back, and maybe they can get a first by taking back some like actively bad money as well. Also a note here that this sort of trade, I was like, oh, what trade exceptions are the Wizards using? I'm like, oh no, actually they can just trade. This trade just works straight up, because as long as you're staying under the first apron, the trade rules are now extremely liberal, and it's very easy to add money if you're kind of in between having cap space all the way up to the first apron. Like this new system, it hard caps you high, but it also kind of doesn't really care if you're moving stuff around in that kind of 30 million range between the minimum team salary and the first apron. I guess it's more than that. It's probably more about like 40 million.
And then one other thing to track on this is that it does make it, to me, less likely that the Wizards guarantee Landry Shamet, because now they have a little less wiggle room with the tax and everything else. So we'll see. That we'll get that clarification in the next couple of days, because his guarantee date, I believe it's the 29th.
Yeah, and for Portland, it wasn't just that they saved the $7 million difference between Avdija and Brogdon. They also got off of $4.5 million for the 14th pick as well. So that's now they have plenty of space to do everything that they want to do. They're like $5 million below the tax, and could have as many as 15 players on roster, depending on what they do with Banton and Jabari Walker and Toumani Camara. Let's finish up actually here before we move on with the other team that traded with Washington, and that's the Knicks. And before we even get into their draft, they had a huge signing today that is one of the biggest things that's happened.
Yeah, you could argue it's maybe the biggest thing that happened the whole day, and that is OG Anunoby returning to the New York Knicks. It is a 5-year deal, though the last year is a player option, so we usually say that's a 4+1 for $212.5 million.
Yeah, mock-off season doesn't quite predict all. We did a 4+1 for $200 million. There was reporting that Anunoby would have had offers, maybe even multiple offers, for a 4-year deal at the max elsewhere. And that deal would have been 4 for $181. So this gives him more guaranteed money over 5 years and starts him about $6 million below the max. He'll start at $36 million, but you get the higher raises, and it's over 5 years. So by the end of this time period, we project that he'll be making $48 million. And if you want to just think of like, what will that contract look like in the last year? Well, Anunoby is 27 right now. So I think that's probably the bigger issue, and particularly considering his health record with this deal. But that will be below the 25% max by the time he reaches the last year of that deal, with how much everything is going to rise between now and then. I mean, this is a lot of money for OG Anunoby. Certainly when the Knicks traded for him, they knew this was probably going to happen. It became even more imperative, I guess, to re-sign him now that you've thrown all this stuff in for Mikal Bridges. And so the $36.6 million is basically, based on what's been reported, is the least that his cap number could be. Putting in incentives doesn't help you at all, because those count against the apron.
Yes, they
so
do.
Now, absent further moves, we're still going to make the assumption, we don't know how yet, that they're going to figure out a way to not get hard capped at the first apron. We had an extensive discussion on that yesterday on Dunc'd On Prime, if you want to go back and listen to the mechanics of that, under these new rules, in which basically if you take in more money than you send out in any trade, unless you have some kind of trade exception, you are going to be hard capped at the first apron. Right now, they are $9 million below the first apron, and they only have 10 players on their roster Actually, let's see, let me take that out real quickly. Sorry about that. Spreadsheet was complaining on me. So, yeah, they basically would have 11 million under the first apron with 10 players if they bring in Pacom Dadier, who they drafted number 25 overall. Some wiggle room around there, but that's not enough to bring back Isaiah Hartenstein. Some talk still that what they have to offer, which would be 16.4 in the first year, wouldn't be enough to bring him back. But if they can avoid getting hard capped at the first apron, which I think they should be able to do, they have 22 million below the second apron. And so you use 16 million of that on a Hartenstein, you're up to 11 players. You're still playing a pretty dangerous dance with the second apron. So they probably would have to cut at least some salary. That would make it extremely unlikely that Precious Achiuwa could be back. He won't get a qualifying offer if they feel like they have a deal with Hartenstein. And then we'll have to see from there. So it's Anunoby going for this much makes things a lot harder. I think they could still get it done with Hartenstein, but it might also be an indication that they just he's gone and they just they're not going to be able to keep up with OKC, who's now been rumored again to be back in it after it was thought that they'd be out or whatever. So,
and going back to Anunoby,
yeah,
I think this is a pretty remarkable contract in terms of the general history of lower usage defense first players on the perimeter, where, you know, Anunoby, the highest usage rate he's had, Basketball Reference version of the stat, in his entire career is 20.5. You and I have been huge fans of Anunoby throughout his career. And, you know, especially with his ability, which, you know, it's not every single possession, but he could space the floor. Last year, he shot 38% on 5.5 per 36. And is, of course, a fantastic defender, isolation team, all that fun stuff. Remember the way that he helped shape the end of that Sixers series where he was guarding Joel Embiid for some key stretches. And so I think that Anunoby, like, those guys have been underpaid. That is the way that it has worked out. The Jaden McDaniels extension, that's looking good for the Wolves, and numerous other ones, Mikal Bridges, incidentally, among them, over the years. This is kind of the first of those kind of guys who it doesn't have a huge scoring load getting paid. And I'm happy to see it happen. They're some of my favorite players in the league. And the Knicks being on the front edge of this, you could say, is unfortunate for them. But they also traded for Anunoby knowing that a deal like this was a possibility, if not a probability.
Yeah, and great job by Anunoby getting here. Now he's maybe not going to have the offensive role that he dreamed of, but he's going to be paid like he does have that.
Sure.
And this is how you get paid like this, is you're on a team that just desperately needed your services. They don't have other huge salaries, right? Like if the Knicks had two guys better than OG Anunoby that were actually being paid like it, then they couldn't afford to do this, at least under the aprons. Maybe they're just going to go way into the second apron going forward here, which starting next year probably, although Randall could also just not be on the team anymore. They have a lot of interesting things that are going to happen extension-wise over the next few months, most likely. So this makes things difficult for New York. I think this is easily the most a player like this has ever been paid. I mean, this is basically over the 25% max over 5 years. Even someone like Otto Porter, that was only a 3+1. He's getting more than him, and that was a restricted free agent offer sheet as well. And of course, that was a terrible contract, and this will end up being a terrible contract in the end, at least in terms of his production to the salary. But it's really about the team construction, and if they're in the conference finals every year for the next 4 years, this will have been worth it to keep him because he's a good player, and they had the ability to fit him into their salary structure, at least for now.
Do you want to circle back and finish the Blazers draft, or do you want to hit Clingan in the flow?
Here, let's finish up with the Knicks. Yeah, I apologize. I forgot about the Blazers. Did some other important stuff here. But yeah, let's finish up with New York. They moved 26 and sent it to OKC for 5 second rounders, some of which might be interesting. Other ones won't be. They're all from 25 to 27. And those will be very useful for New York, either to make trades, get guys on the team who are making the absolute minimum salary, that rookie minimum, which you only get the benefit of if a guy is drafted with your own second round pick. Do you get to pay him, have him count for less against the tax than the minimum, the 2-year minimum? So seems like fair enough value for 26. And then they got Pancam Dadier, who there's thought he might be a stash guy just to save them some money. He's not making that much more than the second year minimum anyway, although every dollar will count. He said he plans to come over. That's what a lot of guys say. We'll see what ends up happening with them. But I actually kind of liked some of the brief film that I saw on Dadier. He is pretty big, a true small forward size. He's 6'7", almost 6'8" in shoes, almost a 9-foot standing reach, 6'9" wingspan. And has a pretty good skill of like he can shoot off the dribble, he can shoot from three. He's got a high release on his jumper, like reasonably athletic. I don't know if he's like, a nuclear athlete, but he's got great size, like looks the part of an NBA small forward, and has like pretty interesting shooting and dribbling ability. He played in the German league last year, so looked like I didn't scout him very much, but he certainly, just watching a 4-minute video of him, I was much more interested in him than a lot of these guys who went in the draft.
Somehow there was a French guy in this draft that I didn't scout. I don't know how exactly that happened, but Didier, I'm excited to watch him at some point, whether that is summer league this year or in the future. And it may be that resolves over the course of all this stuff, and it does the difference of roughly $1 million. Is that something that the Knicks need to count? And do you want to bring him over? And he's on the young side, so maybe theoretically, but we'll have to see in that respect. And I'm a little bit more negative than you are on the 26 trade. They're getting 5 seconds, but they're all pretty weak. Like this, as hilarious as it is, OKC has 1 billion picks, but their second rounders don't have a ton of equity. Even though these picks have utility to the Knicks, I generally still think that picks after 45 are funny money. And so to give up an actual first for this, I'm not saying it's unjustified for the Knicks, but I think this is a very good piece of OKC, who basically created a first-round pick out of whole cloth.
I think 3 of these have a decent chance of being above 45. 26 Warriors, 27 most favorable OKC, Houston, Miami, Indiana, and most favorable in 27 of OKC, Houston, Miami, Indiana. So I think at least a couple of those could be pretty decent. But again, I think a lot of that is kind of financially focused, or just to have like some bullets to fire for a team now that is going to be facing a lot of Stepien restrictions.
Sure.
Yeah, let's get back to Portland then, unless we have anything else on New York.
Well, so for Portland, yeah. So we go back, and so they've already made the Avdija move, which we already, of course, detailed, and then they're picking at 7, and you kind of have to see where things shake out. They could have theoretically moved up. It does sound like Mike Schmitz and company valued Donovan Clingan. Woj told a story on the broadcast about he and Schmitz watching Clingan at was that a high school? It was a high school practice at like 6 a.m. in Connecticut. And so the challenge in these circumstances is reading the board, reading the tea leaves. And let's say you like a player. Do you need to move up to get them? Are there players that you like similarly, or will they fall to you? And we don't know exactly how all of this happened, especially considering the possibility that Charlotte was going to trade their pick to Memphis. But it ends up being that Portland gets Donovan Clingan, and they don't have to move up for him. And while Clingan is he's another center-only player, and this team has DeAndre Ayton on a max contract and has Rob Williams if he can ever be healthy again. Clingan, in his best, you talked about this well with Gavoni. What he provides as a rim protector and his basically the floor that he can bring on that end, and maybe there's some untapped potential offensively, either shooting or as a passer, that could make a real difference for the Blazers moving forward. We don't know how much he's going to play in his rookie year. And I mean, again, I think that even if I'm lower on Clingan, there were things that he doesn't do that modern centers do that I wish he did, that he wish he had in his bag.
Yeah. I mean, you do wish they had drafted like a slightly better pick and roll partner for Scoot Henderson, but yeah, that was supposed to be DeAndre Ayton, who they traded for, is on a max contract. So
exactly. And so
a different direction now.
So if you can, in a weak draft, if you can pick up a defensive foundational piece at 7 without having to move up, give up any treasure, do it. That I think that's a work that could work out extremely well for them.
Well, I think it's really good value for them, and part of that was just the way that the draft broke. And I'll credit Gavoni for saying, "Hey, it might break differently if someone trades up, but if they don't, this is how we see it playing out." And I think they did well there. But like Clingan is a guy I recommend people listen to our full scout on him now. I think those become particularly interesting now that you know where a guy has ended up. But I kind of see him as falling into like that kind of, 13 to 19 range in terms of our center rankings. And I probably had him, I think, 5th on my board. So, yeah, good value there to get a guy that I think will be a starter, will be, like, I think he might even be, close to an all defense candidate with the new rules. I don't know if he'll be a top 2 center, but I think he could be a top 5, and that's probably a top 10 defensive player in the league. He has some versatility issues, maybe defensively, but particularly for the regular season. Like, they just got a good player. He, to me, is the highest floor player in this draft just because I feel very confident that his big skill, like his rim protection, might be the one best skill that I'm most confident in translating of any prospect in this draft. So I think they did pretty well here, and they also did well to not get suckered into trading up either. And San Antonio, I think, tried to do this Zoom meeting with him. I think, to not buy that was, there's a possibility he was going to be the pick there. And Detroit had centers. Charlotte, I would have thought very seriously about taking him as Charlotte. We'll talk a little more about what they did do, but yeah, I think this is good value here. Let's get in now to the Houston Rockets. Unless there's no other Portland picks, are there? Am I missing any other ones?
I think no, right? They don't have any other selections, so we can get back into the draft in order. And Houston picks up they have the Brooklyn pick, which moves up to 3 in the lottery. And of course, it sounds like there were a lot of discussions about what Rafael Stone and company wanted to do with this. And it ends up being that they draft and are intending to keep Reed Sheppard. Sheppard, an unbelievable shooter out of Kentucky. A key question is going to be, can he run an NBA offense? How good is he at that? But he is a good enough shooter that he can do other things. And I like Sheppard. We both had him high. We both had him better than this. Overall, higher than 3rd. You had him 1 and 2. And I specifically really like Reed Sheppard's fit with both the current and potential future Houston Rockets, because his shooting, it meshes well with Şengün. It meshes well with some of the forwards that they have who can be limited in that respect. So you're getting a lot from the one. And the Rockets have playmaking in a couple different facets where they have Fred VanVleet right now. I think that VanVleet and Sheppard can work together, even if that's not going to be the intended pairing all the time. But also Sheppard and Amen Thompson, where Amen Thompson can guard point of attack. If that's not something that Reed Sheppard can do, he can also guard bigger players, of course. And so I can't say I definitely would have done this compared to the offers that were on the board, because we don't know what those were. But I will say, getting Reed Sheppard here, I think it's really good for the Rockets.
Yeah, he's the highest upside player in the draft to me. Like, I think there's a possibility that he just becomes an offensive superstar with his shooting. I think his passing is really good. I think he can actually become a much better pick and roll player than he's shown, particularly if he's got a roll man like Şengün to play off of. He can also run plenty of DHO off-ball stuff, handoff game stuff with Şengün. He's really good at just reading a defense, reading closeouts. So I think he could become very powerful in that as kind of a low-rent Jamal Murray, Nikola Jokic sort of pairing. And then, yeah, this is the perfect team with the prospects they have to help out with his weaknesses, but he can still be very useful as a help defender if he's mostly playing on the ball. They got other guys who can guard the ball. And even Jalen Green, who you might say, oh, does this mean Jalen Green is on the move? And if Sheppard really pops, maybe, but Green could really pop next year too. We'll see. Like, this is at this point in your development still for Houston, like just having 2 outs of guys on the perimeter who could be like the dominating scorer shooter that you need. And then also consider too that Sheppard, going to be on a rookie deal. Like, I think he'll find ways to just contribute. Like, they desperately need shooting anyway. Even if he doesn't become a star, he'd be a very useful player for them. And so I really like that aspect as well. And he can play with Amen. Amen could bring the ball up. He could play off the ball. He could play pick and roll with Amen as well. You got all these athletes. He's great at the hit ahead passes that can kill you in transition as well. I think if he's your smallest guy, you could still maybe do a little bit of switching because of the help stuff that he could do, his intelligence. And so, yeah, I really like this fit. You've got all these athletes like Eason, and, they still got Dylan Brooks there too. Like, plenty of guys who can protect him defensively. So this is like, if you had to build a player out of clay that they were just missing in their program, this would be that prospect to me. And he does some very, very intriguing things in terms of the skill level that he's shown. And I'm not saying he for sure will be a superstar, but if all that shit actually works out, I think he could be that, at least a star.
I wonder where Houston is going to be in our young core rankings next year. That'll be it. So, that pod is 9-10 months away, but I'm already thinking about where it'll fit in because most of their guys will still be age eligible. Could stay in.
And one more thing on Houston too. Like, this is why I love going through each team and spending, a half hour or so on them, is it really became clear to me of like, what is the trade with 3 that you'd be willing to make as Houston? Like, okay, should they go get like Brandon Ingram? Like, no, I would, like, that just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And I think like you get a chance to get another talent like this in the door, that to me makes it, and you like Sheppard, that makes it a lot easier to just forestall this, whatever big star trade they're supposedly in on of the guys who are available. It just, like, I don't think it would have made sense to move this pick for those guys. And, hopefully Sheppard will be good enough that he's not a new car you're driving off the lot, that he could actually increase his trade value by playing well.
Yeah, that is the hope for sure.
All right, let's get to San Antonio now. And
when we previewed their offseason, I've talked about how I don't have a ton of faith in the Spurs front office. The best thing they've done in the last couple of years was draft Victor Wembanyama #1. Congratulations, you made a bold move there.
Trade DeJounte Murray, that was pretty good.
Sure, the DeJounte Murray trade, yeah, that is also very good. And there are people who are significantly bigger Stephon Castle supporters than the 2 people who recorded this podcast together.
Yeah, John had him second on his board.
Yeah, and I mean, a number of people whose opinions you and I respect too. And we don't need to rehash everything that we talked about. We did a full scout on Castle a few days ago. And you discussed him at length with Gavoni and with Keandre. But Castle's limitations, I think, are extremely frustrating for the Spurs to draft, where his jump shot is not great. You can argue maybe it'll get there in the future, but also his lack of on-ball chops. I mean, he played some point guard in high school, all that type of stuff, but you didn't see it in the UConn film. And so even if there aren't perfect players in this class, to have the 4th pick and walk away with what I think Castle's most likely outcomes are is deeply disappointing.
It just like, okay, I know the Spurs have taught guys to shoot before. They have a lot of success stories there, like DeJounte Murray. Now, think of how many years it's taken DeJounte Murray to get to the point.
And also Chip isn't there anymore, but you can argue it's the organization.
But yeah, worth noting. I mean, they taught Derek White how to shoot at least some. Like they've had some success stories, but they definitely have like banked some on their ability to, and like Kelton Johnson, they made it a little bit better. Like they've had some pretty good draft successes late in the draft. It's really been the guys that they've taken earlier. And I understood the idea of Sohan at #9. I didn't hate that pick at the time. He's kind of hasn't worked out that well, but it's just like to draft another total non-shooter next to Victor when that guy to me also doesn't have like the possible upside of being like a truly dominating offensive player. Like, I'm just not sure exactly how Castle is going to get there, because I think he's a good athlete, but not like an amazing one and not an amazing driver. And I think his shot is as broken as I've seen for any ostensible shooting guard who was drafted this high. I mean, ever maybe. I can't think of. I mean, I guess Isaac Okoro was drafted only a few years ago, but
sure.
But I would say even Okoro was shooting more than Castle at the time. Castle, decent free throw shooter. So, all right, like, you want to say that the shot could work out? Like, yeah, you've probably got a starter. I would say at that point, I don't know that you I struggle to find out how this guy's going to be, like a 20-point a game scorer or something. He does give them some perimeter defense, which they don't have, right? They don't really have a perimeter stopper in their program. Like Trey Jones is probably going to be more of a backup. And the other thing I'll say in their defense is there isn't anyone else other than Holland, who you didn't even like, that I would like, oh man, I would have loved that guy here. And even Holland, he's got his own limitations, but I think he's so much better in transition. I just think he has the superstar upside in a way that Castle doesn't, as like a ball handler and a scorer. And also is younger, and I think his shot is less screwed up, although many people will disagree on that. It would be hard for a shot to be more screwed up than Castle's is at this point.
Well, especially the way that he approaches it, like with the shots that he turned down, that was an indicator as well.
Yeah, but like you always say, the juice being worth the squeeze is the thing here, where like I think for Holland, like if you're going to take a guy who can't shoot at all, you're kind of like we talked about with the men last year, where it's like, oh, all the other shit is so good. Like if this guy figures out a way to shoot it like at all, now we really got something, right? Whereas it's just hard for me to imagine that Castle isn't an off-ball player. And if he's an off-ball player, then like those limitations are pretty bad. It's depressing to me that they're going to do this thing like we saw the Wolves do forever with Karl-Anthony Towns, except Wembanyama is also good on defense, where it's like you have this guy who has this amazing skill level and you decide to utilize that to take a bunch of guys who can't shoot around him and like get by, as opposed to having your goal
teams
be,
did this with Porzingis for years too.
Yeah. Have your goal be making a dominating 5-out offense with Victor Wembanyama as like your worst shooter and give him all the space, give his pick and rolls where he could be the best pick and roll man ever, but he's not going to do that with Stephon Castle and Jeremy Sohan on the weak side.
Yeah.
So again, like I don't know that, like, I certainly, if I were San Antonio, I absolutely would have offered 4 and 8 and maybe even a little something else to Houston to move up for Reed Sheppard. I think Risacher would have been a totally fine pick here too. I don't know what Atlanta's price would have been to get him, but I did, at least on my personal board, I had a pretty massive drop off after the first 4 guys, which were, and on my board at least, which would have been Sheppard, Sarr, Holland, and then Risacher. So San Antonio not getting one of those 4 guys at 4 is disappointing. But if Ron Holland doesn't work out, then I don't know that there's anyone else I'm like, oh, what a blown opportunity here.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a little bit differently. I had Castle 20th on my board, so there are guys.
He wouldn't have been a ton higher than that for me, but it was just extremely flat.
It is flat, but we'll see how those guys work out, and of course, that doesn't mean that if Castle does better than 15 of the 20, they'd be like, there were 5 guys who did better than him, so there's definitely a huge mistake or something like that. But I don't like the theory of it. I don't like the way, and you brought up the idea of like, oh well, if he's an off-ball player, like if he ends up being an off-ball player, unless he's like an elite defender, this probably isn't worth it even in a flood draft. Like that's it. Just generally speaking, that's not the type of player that that's gonna make the huge difference for the team, and it's not the type of swing that I would want to make. Detroit takes Ron Holland 5. We've discussed our disagreements on him. I will note that while I had Holland higher meaningfully than Castle, I had Holland 16. I'm worried about the jump shot. We don't need to rehash all that type of stuff. This is the most fascinating bet on Fred Vinson, because somehow now we brought it up that when they hired Vinson, that the Pistons had the largest potential like shift in value if a shooting coach could fix their problems. Somehow that got that like, oh, it didn't double in size, but it like 1.5 in size by bringing in Ron Holland, because if the jump shot is there, of course he becomes a really, really fun, dangerous player.
Yeah, and I think of some of these guys that you think of that have been Vinson success stories, I think Holland has the most on-ball juice of any of them, compared to, say, like a Dyson Daniels, who wasn't a success story yet, or Herb Jones or Jose Alvarado, a lot of the guys that he's improved over the years. Holiday, even Tyreek Evans. There have been so many guys over the years that he's really helped. But Holland, to me, because of his on-ball juice, I mean, he had 30% usage in the G League. Yeah, he turned the ball over a ton. But, like, he still had 56% true shooting while basically not making a jumper the entire season. And, yeah, it's not a great rim-protecting league, but he's also an 18-year-old, like, getting to the basket a ton. He's really good in transition. I think it's a tough fit, obviously, with Ausar Thompson. Maybe that means that they can go with, like, some more switching groups. But even if you want to go, like, a center, Thompson and Holland, I mean, that's just going to be atrocious. So you're probably going to you can't really play Holland and Thompson together at this point. Maybe Fred Vinson can change that to some degree. But, there's no guarantee that Ausar Thompson is going to work out. Yeah, he's a dominating defender. But to be like, oh, we can't draft another guy because he's kind of like Ausar Thompson when he's clearly, to me, the best talent and the highest upside. I think this is, and also worth noting that this is a new regime in Detroit as well. New enough that they didn't take Michael Tellum's client at 5, Buzelis, who I don't think would have been a crazy pick there, but you probably do.
I do.
So I really like this pick for them. I mean, it may not work out, but particularly because Tidjane Salaün has seen it, and Tidjane Salaün, obviously, his background, like he values shooting, but the fact that he's seen Fred Vinson and has seen him improve a lot of these guys, if one of Holland and Ausar hits, like or at least can make shots at a semi-passable rate, like, but this is just getting more talent on the board. Like to me, they have one guy, Cade Cunningham, who's got all-star potential on this team. So, like, get another one, even if he's got a lot of flaws right now.
I agree with the general mentality. Like Ausar isn't so ingrained in the fabric that you take it to a player, like re-roll these dice. I bring up the Garland Sexton example too much, but that's what this is. I just don't think that Ron Holland was that guy. We don't need to rehash that discussion. We can kind of move forward with it, but I hope it works out if it does. And also getting some athleticism, getting another player who can key their transition potentially could be really valuable, because Cade Cunningham, that's not really his forte. And we'll see where Jaden Ivey's place is on these Pistons moving forward. Charlotte, there was intrigue in terms of whether they were going to ransom out Donovan Clingan once he fell past San Antonio and Detroit. That ended up not happening.
More on that in a second when we get to Memphis, by the way.
Yeah, that ended up not happening. Well, it ended up, we don't know what it would again. They didn't take him. Instead, Charlotte does something that I absolutely did not see coming. And this is, as they're kind of the post cup check era. They drafted Tidjane Salaün, someone we talked about yesterday on the pod, as we did kind of like a mini scout on him. And he's a fascinating talent. I mean, forward who has more like power forward, small ball center size, and plays with a ton of energy. Jump shot is still a work in progress. His inside the arc game is challenging. I called it flat out bad yesterday in the pod. And so he's a roll of the dice, and a weird roll of the dice when your team already has Brandon Miller, but Miller can kind of defend multiple positions. We got into all that type of stuff. So I'm surprised this was the pick. He's not like my guy of the players in this area, but it's also just because, like, I didn't expect Charlotte to be the ones that rolled these dice.
Yeah, again, this at this point in the draft, to me, it was so flat, and I think I can totally understand taking him here. I'm not like, they already have Mark Williams. Mark Williams hasn't shown enough to me to say we can't draft Clingan over the top of him. It seemed like their attempt to hold Clingan hostage because Portland was waiting there to obviously take him at 7. Didn't work. They couldn't get Portland to move up necessarily.
But
and
wait, quickly, let's say, because there was, with the possibility that they were going to move up with Memphis. The other question here is, could Charlotte have moved down, let's say it was to Memphis at 9, and still gotten Salaün? Because I think they probably could have. Maybe, San Antonio, they're the area French guy. Maybe they're going to take another French guy. Like, if the draft is flat and you like a specific player in that who's probably still going to be there, you might want to trade down.
There's a history of guys like that always getting drafted higher than you think. Koulibaly, just got to go back a year to see that, right? So And that was even Washington felt like they had to move up to get him from 8 to
Mhm.
7 at the cost of, I think it was a couple of seconds. So I do think like, and he's also the kind of guy that teams kind of keep their interest secret. And yeah, I think there might have been a concern with San Antonio. I mean, it wouldn't shock me honestly if the reason the Dillingham trade happens is because Salane was not there for San Antonio at 8. Like that certainly is something that I could believe. And I also don't think, and we could talk about this now. We'll talk more about Edey's fit there, but my guess would be that Memphis was like, we have a low limit on what we're willing to pay to go get Clingan instead of Edey. I would, and Edey's going to be fascinating there. I can't wait to see. We'll talk more about it in a second. But my guess would be that they were okay just sitting there and taking Edey at 9, and they're like, all right, if we could move up and get Clingan, we're okay with that. Clingan, and I also wouldn't have loved Clingan's fit in Charlotte because they really want to run. He's decent running the floor, but he's not like a fast guy. He's not like a great pick and roll finisher. And they need more forwards. Salane is a guy who really plays with great effort. He's crazy right now, but he plays with great effort and he runs the floor really hard. Hopefully they can teach him to be a little bit more impactful with that 9-2 standing reach on defense. But he's exactly the sort of player that they need as just like an energy forward with a lot of length. They don't really have anyone like that. Does this augur perhaps that Miles Bridges could be gone? That might be another aspect to this as well. I mean, that would leave them with just kind of Grant Williams, who's not, he's an okay player, but not, a foundational piece going forward. So I think, like, again, he fits into a totally modern player, doesn't probably have on-ball star upside, but he's absolutely someone who can just be like a very solid starting 4-man and fits into the way you want to play, running like crazy.
Like you, I want to see if how this affects Miles Bridges. We'll get that context in 5 days or so. And I think that it's a far enough, like it's going to take him some time. And so maybe you could and forwards, you could play forwards together in multiples if you want or need to. And so especially like Miller could potentially play some 2 and all that type of stuff. I mean, at times we've seen Bridges already play some 3. I mean, it's how you want to defend them. Salon is going to be small. Whether he's even going to start or not, we'll have to, eventually we'll get that in time. So yeah, I think I had my board a little bit differently, but it's within the realm. And so then Portland takes Clingan at 7. We already talked about that. And we get back to San Antonio. San Antonio has the 8 pick which they got in the Acapulco trade, and the timing on this led to me doing some wild speculation because the first thing we heard
Oh baby, yeah, that's right.
Was that this pick is going to be Rob Dillingham, who was rumored to be going to San Antonio for a while, but that it was going to Minnesota. And it's just like, oh man, what in the world is going from Minnesota to San Antonio? And I'm like, I started thinking about like Karl Anthony Towns. I started thinking about McDaniels or something else. And no, it's not. It's neither of those. Instead, it is a future-centric thing. The Timberwolves send their own first in 2031, unprotected, and then a top 1 protected 2030 pick swap to the San Antonio Spurs in exchange for the 8th pick and Rob Dillingham. 8th pick, who is Rob Dillingham?
Yeah, incidentally, this is now the second top 1 protected pick swap that the San Antonio Spurs own. They also have a 2028 of those from Boston from the Derek White trade. So that clearly is something that they they don't mind proposing. So let's look at it from the San Antonio standpoint first. I think this is a good move. I didn't love anyone here. I think Dillingham, at least from my standpoint, is a backup. I just generally, particularly when you have Victor Wembanyama, like, yes, okay, you might be able to say this is sort of the opposite of what I was complaining about on offense, where it's like, oh, you have this really skilled 5. Now let's put a bunch of non-shooters around because we have this skilled 5. But on the other end, taking Dillingham would have been doing the same thing. It's like, instead of building a great defense, let's get these guys who are all offensive players that Victor Wembanyama is going to have to bail out instead of just overall being stout. And you can get away with guys like that. I just lower on Dillingham. Like, John was really high on him and his shooting and creation. Like, I think he's going to be, offensively, like, a solid-ish NBA point guard. But then, he has these defensive concerns as well because he's just so thin. And I don't think he's like so dominating athletically. And I think he's going to be good, but not like, one of the best shooters in the league or anything like that, as some of those stats might indicate. So I think he's a good player, a guy who can be a potential starting point guard in time with the right pieces around him. But I don't think that if you're the San Antonio Spurs and you're aiming high, that Rob Dillingham is a guy that you think of as your starting point guard of the future. I think that's maybe the easiest position to acquire a star at. And so I completely get just punting on this draft and getting these two assets in the future at a time when, in one form or another, Glenn Taylor is unlikely to own the team. And Tim Connolly will be, on a new team making 3 times what he's making now to be their GM, probably. There is a feeling like, oh, this is still an Ant's prime, but that's like, getting to, that would be the end of, he would have to be on another contract by then,
right,
with the Wolves. I do have concerns for the Wolves, and we'll see whether Dillingham works out here. Like he could be a big piece of whether they still are relevant 5 years from now, and relevant enough for Edwards to stick around, because they are still very low on draft picks. But I think so I think this is fine for San Antonio. Like this is a pick that has a single digit next to it. Oh my God, like how can you get something that's so far in the future for it? But this is what Minnesota had to trade. And ironically enough, we'll talk more about this later when we wrap up, but they are the only one of these teams that, due to the Stepien rule, like all of a sudden had draft picks coming online that actually made a move tonight, which was surprising to me. So I think this is a good move for San Antonio, and you can always move these picks later. And it's just another bet. They've got another pick swap as well with Dallas in that 2030 year. What about from Minnesota's perspective, Danny? What do you make of this for them?
Well, so just briefly on San Antonio,
Okay,
I think the bet against the board is a potentially worthwhile one, but I think there are guys who could have helped them, and like, so I mean, San Antonio.
Who would you have taken here if you
Carrington?
Them?
I mean,
yeah,
just would have been there.
Yeah,
and
I don't think that Carrington has enough. If you're the San Antonio Spurs, your goal is to have a superstar at point guard.
Well, yeah, but you're
someday.
Drafting Carrington there doesn't preclude you from doing that in the future. I mean, I think, and the problem for San Antonio is how many more bites at this kind of the apple are they going to get? Because you're trying to build this young foundation around it, and they drafted Castle, who I think has a relatively low ceiling, and I would say a relatively low floor. And so you need to do, and now maybe with cap space, they could do some of that. But if your own picks get worse, the Bulls pick, maybe that's a way that you could potentially get into some of that. But I think that San Antonio, like their foundation around Wembanyama, and I think that some of these teams, I mean, you go back to Omer Asik and all those type of things before, like teams have built too fast. This isn't building too slowly. It's just building poorly. That's the way that I would describe it so far. Plenty of time to rectify that. Plenty of time to do it. This is not a 1 or 2 year thing, but the foundation for me over the next, like the young core of the Spurs is woefully deficient with considering their star, and they had a chance to add to it. They didn't, and that could end up working out. It could not. We'll see where the pick goes. But for Minnesota's perspective,
well, I guess last thing that I want to react to what you just said on San Antonio. So you would not have done the deal. You would have just taken Carrington or somebody else here.
I think so, because I'm not a believer that Minnesota's that you're getting a ton of upside of those. Like, of course, there's the variance that occurs with any team, but you also have to run into that unprotected picks are almost never, like it takes something like what happened with Brooklyn for that to actually get into the area where you're really getting excited. Is it possible that the 2031 draft is a lot better? Of course it is. It probably will be, because this draft is weak compared to most. But I think that there are times where, in part because of those Nets ones that went so poorly, most of the time these end up being late firsts or late lottery picks. And the idea that that pick is going to it'll be a value add to the Spurs at that point, and it'll be a cost control player and all that. But I think that there can be a shiny object issue with some of these, and I brought that up as a possibility with the Knicks stuff too.
I can't wait until we're talking about the Spurs having the best package to trade for Anthony Edwards in 2029, because they have these two unprotected Wolves assets. Yeah, I would have done this deal. I think that these two things, even a year from now, are more likely than not to have greater trade value than whoever they would have taken at 8. And I didn't think that they even had like a great fit for like a guy that I thought would be a starter next to Wembanyama. So I totally understand this part of it. Obviously, I didn't like the Castle part. For Minnesota, I think Dillingham, the way their team is built, although whether he will actually be good enough before Rudy Gobert ages out is a question. But the way their team is built and the fact that he's next to Edwards, you need a point guard who can shoot. Like they have a massive hole in their team building once Mike Conley ages out. They're very lucky to get him on the extension that they did, but he could fall off at any time. Dillingham, if he emerges as a starter in the next couple of years, will be on a great contract for them. They probably will end up cutting some money elsewhere, but this is, as a team, actually over the second apron, just trading for a draft pick, which doesn't count anything before you're on your cap. Before you sign him is actually one of the few ways you can add salary. And so I think they really had no other way other than this to get a potential starting point guard in the building. And one of the things I was critical of when they made the deal for Gobert was, well, what are you doing 5-6 years from now when Anthony Edwards is truly in his prime and you've given up all these draft assets and Rudy Gobert isn't good anymore? So this is actually a little bit of a way to rectify this. And I do think that this is, particularly with Edwards' ability to guard and be really physical at the two. And then you also need a point guard who can play off the ball. Dillingham's a little bit different a type of a player than Mike Conley, particularly defense and athletically. But I think offensively, he's exactly what you're looking for and could realistically get. So of all the places that Dillingham could end up, he's not going to be ready right away, of course, to contribute next year other than as like a light backup. But I think this is one of the best fits that he could have found. So this makes sense to me for Minnesota. You're like, oh man, this is the number 8 pick. How good could this guy be? Like for where Minnesota is right now, Dillingham makes so much more sense than he would have made for me in San Antonio, because San Antonio, you're still in shoot for the moon phase, whereas Minnesota's like, yeah, if we could get the 20th best point guard in the NBA with this move, absolutely, we'll do that.
I'm really excited about this move from Minnesota's perspective. I'm, first of all, higher on Dillingham than you in general, but because what I thought Minnesota needed most in their loss in the playoffs was more creation, more players who could stress out a defense. And while Dillingham doesn't do it in all of the ways, he does it in enough as a shooter, as a driver, even if he's not strong enough to finish everything around the basket. And as a passer, I think he's good, not ridiculous, to balance things out really well with Anthony Edwards. And so you brought up that he's different than Conley. I agree with that, but he can create some of that. And then, as you mentioned, you also need that player who's a more of a secondary or at times a primary creator to be able to shoot. And I believe that Rob Dillingham can shoot. And because Edwards can defend point of attack when you need him to, because they have so many other good defenders around on this team with McDaniels and of course, with Rudy, as long as he's there, everything else, like they can handle those shortcomings, and getting creation is really hard. And part of the reason that you acquire Rudy Gobert in the first place is that you can handle some more limited players. Now, you don't kind of the reverse of what we talked about invoking Porzingis before. That doesn't mean, put a bunch of Lilliputians around Rudy Gobert and it'll be fine. That's what Utah did. And there were some flaws with that. But Dillingham, I think he was about the best that the Wolves could do within their constraints. And I applaud Tim Connelly for his creativity to make this happen.
Yeah. And he's one of the better shooting point guard prospects who can actually do other stuff that you're going to see. And that is a good fit. I still don't love having a guy that can just be attacked so easily defensively as I think he will be. but he's in the absolute best position, I would say, to succeed. So and I might have had him a little bit lower than this, but I think that was in part because I was kind of viewing him in just any situation. Being in this situation, I like it more. Let's finish up here on Memphis, then we'll take it to a part 2 on Dunc'd On Prime, and obviously we'll take some questions and comments too if you guys want to get those in. But I have not had a chance to listen yet to your wrap up on Zach Edey. I think everyone has an idea of kind of like what he's supposed to be, but are you like just too concerned about him like being a big stiff that it's just not going to work? Or do you think that like his strengths are big enough to deal with that, and B, like just how stiff is he actually defensively?
Edey actually moves his feet okay for a guy his size. It's just that guys his size can't move their feet. So I don't think that he is scheme versatile. I mean, there were different games where whoever it was just shooting because they knew Edey wasn't going to get out there. For me, the bigger story, as incredibly productive as he was as a 2-time National Player of the Year, to me, the story is actually kind of neither of the things you mentioned, which is that I don't think at the NBA level, his strengths are strong enough. I don't think that the post-up stuff is going to work quite as well. He's more deliberate, more contemplative than a lot of these guys. He's not mashing in the same way that a Jokic or a Nurkic does. And while he can set a good screen, he can make a decent pass, I don't think that he is a reasonable facsimile of that. And then the more important part of that, in some ways, the offense, which I think there are ways that the offense can work, is that I don't think he's a great rim protector defensively. And so you get this big guy, but he's not scheme versatile. Donovan Clingan isn't scheme versatile, but he's really good at the things he does. I don't believe that Edey is going to be a great rim protector. He is a gigantic human being, but he doesn't do that. And he'll rebound, but being the rebounder, to me, that's a little less central. You can get good rebounding in a number of different ways. So I don't love this. Like, for example, I not only didn't have Edey equal with Clingan, I had another center between them who went much later in the draft. We'll talk about him on Prime. But I'm not sold on Edey as an NBA starter. I'm not sold on Edey even necessarily as a high-end reserve, because to me, the strengths, it's more about the strengths than the weaknesses, that they're both very present.
Yeah, Gavoni seemed like he's pretty high, and we didn't talk about him, but just based on the way he's written it. So I haven't watched him that much. I'm looking forward to seeing him more in Summer League, but I actually think that the concept of him is very, very interesting as basically Steven Adams, only more so of what Steven Adams was for this group. Like, I mean, Edey was like 5 offensive rebounds a game, like crazy offensive rebounding. Gavoni says he like sets these monster screens, and he actually has some ability to some facility there. He's got a big target going towards the basket. He's got this 7'11" wingspan and huge reach. I think there's also, with his rim protection and his defense, he's playing 40 minutes a game, so he's in shape. He plays really hard. But maybe his rim protection is better when he's playing 25 minutes a game for Memphis, or 20 minutes a game, and he doesn't have to worry about, being the best player in college basketball and like, college refs fouling you out of the game or getting you in foul trouble. I mean, it would be pretty difficult with the 7'11" wingspan to not be at least somewhat impactful as a rim protector. And I think, they're drafting him and bring him in. Like, they don't really care that he's not scheme versatile, because then you can just play Jaren Jackson Jr. at center or go to Brandon Clark or something too. Like, they're not drafting him to be even necessarily a guy who's going to close games, but he could be another one of these guys who just makes Memphis like such a fucking pain in the ass to play against, where you got this 300-pound guy who he says he like played hockey, he says he loves bashing into people, he loves contact. He goes on the offensive glass, he's setting these massive screens for Ja Morant. Can you imagine him rolling down the lane, like setting the Steven Adams Gortat screen on his own man? And like, I think his fit with Ja is pretty good, just because all Ja needs is like a screen to be set. Try going under when Zach Edey is the guy setting the screen, right? Like, that's, again, this is all in theory. Like, I haven't seen enough of him to know whether he can actually execute on this theory or not. But and he's also like, he's not one of these weird guys who's like, 23 and a half. He just turned 22. He's not like, a crazy age for a senior. So I think the concept here is very interesting. You may disagree, and I'm not questioning you because I haven't watched him enough to say of whether he can actually execute my vision of like this massive Steven Adams clone who's like even more annoying to deal with. But I think that's the idea.
It is. And I mean, Edey is put in a great position to succeed with this pick. Like he will get the opportunity playing with Ja and everything else to make it work. And I hope that he succeeds. I think that his pathway to this point is genuinely impressive, and how much he's improved over these years, and getting his body to the point where he could be considered viable as an NBA player, and betting on himself going back to Purdue. And I mean, it sounds like this is a whole hell of a lot higher than he would have gotten drafted if he'd come out a year ago. And so I wonder how it's going to work out. And I think that there is an element of, well, this is a way that it can work for Memphis, but like, I mean, not, and like, okay, well, they weren't going to switch anyway because John Morant's so small, like, so you can play to drop and everything like that. But we'll see on all that kind of front what are the doors that aren't open, and also like what are the other players that are on. So like I'm more fine with them taking E than pretty much anybody else in this area. But and this is another one that was like, if you thought that he was this good, maybe they had more intel than I do on who could have potentially taken him in this general space. So, yeah, we'll see.
All right, let's hit some of these questions. And apologies to we just had a mix up between me and Dan and when the time was. But yeah, we did not do a live reaction. That would be 3 hours of podcasting before the actual podcast. Might be a little bit much. So, but we'll take some of the questions from them. One of them from Bob was, should the Sixers consider moving an asset to get like a Dorian Finney-Smith and take him into their cap space? I would say no. I would rather just sign, like a Caleb Martin for that same money and not cost you an asset.
Same. And that's the type of move as Philly that you can do kind of last. Like if other things don't happen, you don't need to start there. You can see where everything goes first. And if another team offers Brooklyn enough that they'll take that right away, okay, fine.
Another one was, it's fascinating to hear us so low on Castle when other people are so high on him. And I guess I try not to look at other people's evaluations too much. And it seemed like even John, when I talked to him about Castle, wasn't like amazingly high on him either. He agreed that his shot is kind of fucked, but it's not even so much that the shot is fucked, but that's like, he's definitely a 2, not a 3, even if he's very good size for a 2. But it's just that like even the other stuff I'm not like so wowed by. He's not like, I think he's got very good ability to guard one-on-one, but I don't think he's like a huge defensive playmaker as a help guy. And I think he also like, the ball handling is pretty good for this player type, but like, I don't really know other than just like shooting a floater or shooting a layup. Like at this point, like his offense, like where's the offensive upside if you're taking this guy?
Yeah, I mean,
at number 4, yeah.
The way he's putting pressure on the defense is that they're backpedaling so hard because they don't care about him shooting that maybe they'll fall on each other.
Yeah, and I guess, and it ultimately is like, man, like this is a really low floor guy to me too because of the shot. So that's I struggle to think like, yes, athletically he's the prototypical NBA 2 guard, but he's not like so unbelievable. He's not like an Anthony Edwards style of athlete.
No.
And he just like doesn't really have any kind of a jumper at all as a 2 guard. Like it's just, that's terrifying to me. I think there's just other guys I would rather have. And I didn't see, there's this idea that he sacrificed at UConn. Well, it's like, yeah, but that also like he was able to like offensive rebound. They had all these other shooters around him. He had passers. They went under on every single screen for him, so he could just get to the dotted line whenever he did run a pick and roll with. So yeah, just don't understand it with him. Yeah.
He also got to be put in a position to succeed as a limited shooter because they had all the spacing around him and they had capable passers. Not only Cam Spencer and Newton, but Clingan. I mean, they had all these different guys and a great scheme. Murray and Hurley did a really good job there. I think that UConn actually made Castle look better offensively than he was. I think it's the opposite. And I think that sometimes there's this idea if a player is a part of a good scheme that they're the reason it was good. I think it elevated him rather than vice versa.
Chris is a Pistons fan. He says he likes them going for Holland. He wants them to tank again. And yeah, I mean, we'll see what else they do, but it looks like they're going to try to take on like a Tim Hardaway Jr. or something, use their cap space that way. Maybe they'll sign Bridges, perhaps the Salane pick, and Charlotte augurs that. But I agree, they don't have enough talent in the door. Like trying to get better now when you have Cade Cunningham and a bunch of question marks. And like they've been like trying to get better and like not succeeding. So, and they still have a bunch of young guys that you need to figure out. You're not going to just like bench Jalen Duren now all of a sudden. So yeah, I think that's right. And hopefully they've just acknowledged that the Weaver rebuild failed, and now they can give another shot at it here with Trajan Langdon. How does Castle compare to Anthony Black, Dyson Daniels, Jared Culver? Better than Culver. Culver was like supposed to be really athletic. He just wasn't. There are some similarities, I would say, between Culver, who I also thought was really bad, and Castle. I like Castle a little bit better than Culver because I think Castle at least like has the defensive chops. He's a little bit younger. Culver at least would take some. He had like a brief stretch of decent shooting in his sophomore year. He would at least take them, but I always thought his shot was pretty fucked. I
really liked Anthony Black's floor game. I thought that I was concerned about his jump shot and some of the other stuff with him. I was lower on Black than you were in the process, but did like some of that. And that, of course, is a parallel with Dyson Daniels, where I thought that his defensive tools were compelling. And then he had this floor game. It was just like with Daniels, it was always all he needs is to be able to shoot. And whereas with Castle, I think the shot would be great, but in order for him to be a clear-cut starter, he needs more development than just the shot. The shot is a prerequisite, but it's not the only prerequisite.
Yeah, and Castle's a better finisher at the rim than Daniels, but Daniels also has this nice little 2-foot floater that he can get to. And I would say Castle's shot to me looks worse than Daniels did at this point in time. Ra, how do you project the Timberwolves 20, 30, and 31 draft picks? We don't know. I think there is a possibility they could be pretty decent. I mean, I made that tongue-in-cheek joke about them the Spurs trading for Anthony Edwards and using the 2030 and 2031 to do it, the way we just kind of saw the Nets trying to get their pick back from the Rockets, etc. And now we're talking about the Rockets trying to get the Suns guys because they have their picks. The
2030 draft, that will be, I think Edwards will be age 27 or 28 that year. So
yeah, I mean that'll be his 10th year in the league, right? So so he will have had to get a new contract by that point. Yes. But it's really, I mean, the odds are, I guess, that he's still there, but you never know. No clue what's going to happen in the league 7 years from now. It's really more about that. There is no way to project it. That's why you do it.
Yeah, and so the idea is basically you're probably, in most circumstances, you're not going to get a top 5 pick this way. There are exceptions, including this year, but there's a lot of variance within it. They could have not only, I mean, there's a chance that they could have a really good team then and just be unhealthy. That can happen too. And so, like, for example, that's what New Orleans kind of is betting on when they basically took the Lakers 25 pick over 17 this year. Like, there's a distinct chance that pick ends up being worse than 17. Also, that draft is going to be better. But like that, uncertainty can actually benefit you from a draft perspective because there are more things that can drag you down, like organizationally or an injury or something like that. I can do this one quickly for Patrick Gallagher. Would Houston be interested in Anthony Simons? I don't think so now. I think that with Sheppard in the door, they have enough of this kind of like creation shooting element in place. And especially if Portland is asking for significant assets, and you and I both like Simons, the impetus, the motivation, the necessity of getting Simons is a lot lower now. And so, I mean, if the asset price is low, certainly you could talk to them. And a nice thing that Houston has in any of these negotiations is a lot of filler expiring salary if they end up picking up with Landale and with Jeff Green. So from that perspective, they could probably simultaneously save the Blazers money and they could do something. But I don't think you give up what it's necessary to get Simons when you already have Van Vliet and Green and you have and Sheppard.
Wilker is a big Blazers fan. He's complaining about the CJ trade. He says all we have is Chris Murray. No, you got Jeremy Grant from that. You had the trade exception. I think they also ended up trading that Milwaukee pick that they got from the Pels was how they got Jeremy Grant as well. And they saved a bunch of money. They weren't going to extend CJ the way the Pels did either. And he's also saying that he is concerned that this Avdija trade is going to give the Blazers cover to not make another move this offseason. Yeah, I'm a little concerned about that too. But if they do it by the trade deadline and they get something for Grant, that's fine as well. We talked about that pretty extensively already. All right, let's wrap this up here. Thanks so much for joining us on YouTube. And of course, you can join us on Dunc'd On Prime with the code MOCKOFFSEASON2024. Get 25% off. That's either for a month, or I recommend doing it for a year to lock in that 25% off for an entire year. Be pretty valuable for you. And you also get a ton of savings off the monthly rate anyway by doing a year. And we still have all of our draft scouts up there. You can get into those a little bit more as well. If now that you know where those guys landed, that's still great content. Mock-off season's still pretty darn good, actually. Not that much has happened since then. It's predicted some stuff, and of course, you get all of our coverage through the end of transaction season, wrap up of every roster player in summer league. So we got a lot of great stuff coming here. So I recommend giving that a shot. That's Mock Off Season 2024. Link is in the show notes. We'll be back on Dunc'd On Prime to talk about the final 21 or so picks of the first round.